You're listening to Conversations with Chanda, a podcast that unpacks the community's grittiest, most vexing problems, hosted by Chanda Smith Baker. In this episode, we have Pulitzer Prize finalist Lee Hawkins, who shares his personal journey to trace his family's history. Lee reveals how uncovering the resilience and sufferings of his ancestors helped him confront and challenge the systems of oppression that perpetuate trauma and marginalization. Through his investigative reporting and genealogical research, Lee shares eye-opening insights into the intergenerational impact of racial violence and racism on Black families. Enjoy the show.
I grew up in a very strong religious Baptist foundation, which is really still, as far as I'm concerned, how I move about the world. I belong to church. I believe in it. And it was a big part of my life. I had a big village behind me, but we lived in the suburbs. And so when we lived in the suburbs, but we spent a lot of time in the city in St. Paul and Minneapolis with family members, that was a very difficult kind of transition to make when we would go back into the suburbs because it was a very white community at that time. Maplewood, Minnesota was 99% white. And we were these Black people living in a community where there was a lot of hate speech. There was a lot of just resistance to Black people integrating these neighborhoods. And so me being, as my mom defined it, an outspoken, inquisitive young Black boy was a very big challenge for my parents. But it was just who I was, right? And so I think that how I started to think about trauma was that when I was a kid, my father used to have nightmares. And he was my hero, right? I didn't think my father was afraid of anything. So I remember asking him when he woke up one day, I asked him, "Dad, what were you dreaming about last night?" And he said, "Alabama, son, Alabama." But he wouldn't go deep into what precisely he was dreaming about. All I knew was that when I did ask questions, when I did assert myself, both at home or outside in the community, particularly the white community, I got the belt. And I think how I was able to connect the two goes all the way back to when I was 6 years old and I saw the movie Roots. And I remember that harrowing scene where Kunta Kinte was whipped for wanting to identify with his true native culture and for his inquisitiveness, his courage to challenge and to be brave to challenge and resist colonization. So when I saw that whip, I remember watching it and I remember looking at my parents because my dad had his arm around my mom on the couch. And I remember even at that young age, I said, I thought that belt has something to do with this whip. And I would say that was where it started. That was that was what really planted my seed of curiosity about where my family came from, what our role in America was, and what happened in Alabama to my father and how that connected to me.
You talked about the transition from the city back to the suburb. That was a transition. And we were talking about community as we were entering into this conversation. And there are people that often think about it being more traumatic coming from the suburb into the city, right? That there's more of all the undesirable things that happen in the city, especially in some of the Black communities. And yet you're really describing it the opposite way of saying that it was a transition going back into white community where you and your family were one of very few. And I have my own wonderful stories about what this community has done for me. And I grew up in North Minneapolis, but that's not how people always see it.
Well, I mean, and right, we're not a monolithic people. And there are many people who I think internalize the racism of the grander society white supremacists come in all shades. They include many Black people. I think that we have to fight. We have to be conscious. I'm passionate, if not self-righteous, about recognizing in my own mind the areas and the behaviors where I catch myself even channeling white supremacy. So I think that it's very easy to believe that your own community is a community that you should fear. That's a community that you should not feel comfortable in. Now, I do want to make sure that I point out that for me, I was uplifted by my community. I've loved the Summit University community, the Rondo community, but I also, from the time I was young, was raised to look over my shoulder. You know, I knew 4 kids when I was in. By the time I graduated from high school, I had 4 kids who I knew who were murdered. And it's very difficult. We have to look at things through a lens of complexity. And we have to start to understand that for as long as our people are stratified, then there will always be that element of self-hatred and desperation that drives the homicide crisis. And so my awareness of that back when I was growing up as a kid in the late 80s was a very powerful. I remember the song Self-Destruction. You're headed for self-destruction. And I remember us marching against what back then we called Black on Black violence, Black on Black crime. And so back then it was something that the young generation acknowledged, addressed as a real problem. And we were very, very steadfast in our commitment to spread love through the community. And so I can't just look at the negative things that happen in our community in isolation, because there were so many other positive things that sort of balance out and overtook that hopelessness that we saw in some people. We can never save everyone. We can try, but there will always be a segment of the population that does not want to be free. And we have to understand that Harriet Tubman probably had a gun for multiple reasons. It wasn't just to protect herself against white people, but there may have been people in her own community that could have disrupted her plan for freedom. And she would have had to be ready for them as well. And so at some point as a community, we have to start to look at that. We have to start to look at the extent to which the bondage belief system, as I call it, has infiltrated the minds of people in the community, and how far we want to go down that hole with them. And at what point does it take the people in the community who are wanting to see the community thrive to move forward and to let the ship sink with the other people in it?
Yeah. And I take it that your curiosity that extends from the time that you were a child brought you into storytelling, journalism, and becoming an author?
Yeah, I think so. You know, I was very involved in politics from the time I was young. And I was very inspired by Dr. Martin Luther King and the campaign for nonviolent social change. At that time, I had not figured out the connection. I thought, you know, to the work that I do now. At that time, I thought that nonviolent social change was about being anti-war, being anti-violence in the community and things like that. I had not connected it to what I connected to now, which is also violence in our homes, and looking at the way that Black children, out of perceived necessity, are, you know, still, and to this day, corporal punishment is a major, major part of the Black family value system. Not all, but we still believe disproportionately at higher rates in corporal punishment. We are also more likely in the 17 states where corporal punishment is legal to allow schools to paddle our children. And so my work, I think, once again, my life experience has informed my work and my curiosity about this. I spent the first 2 decades of my career covering business. I, just finished in 2022 a 19-year career with the Wall Street Journal. And I think that this project was something, that I've been planning for several years. I got the book deal in 2018 and launched this podcast in 2022. But I think that, it was important to pay some rent on the planet. Yeah. And to start to take this experience that I got as an investigative reporter and start to apply it to issues where I believe that I could have impact. And so I have a very, very nuanced understanding of corporal punishment, how it connects to history, and how our parents who love us tremendously feel that pressure to protect us from the police state, not understanding that these generations of whippings that have happened in Black communities and Black homes are actually in accordance with the police state, which are actually because the whipping practice evolved out of the police state. The slave codes and the Black codes, were designed to basically put Black people in positions where, for instance, there was more than 4 Black people without a white person present, or if a Black person was caught reading or writing, they would get between 39 to 100 lashes. And so that, once again, that internalization of what began as a white supremacist practice that was imposed on us by our government was internalized in the home and used in our churches as something that is a prudent way for children to be dealt with. And there are all kinds of health implications for that. So there's a lot of intersectionality in my work. It all fits together. And I think that being curious as a boy definitely led to that. And that life experience really plays a big role in the work I'm doing now.
You watch Roots. And I remember for us in my household, it was a family occasion. It was one of the first times I actually remember having anything on television that was a historical accounting of our history. And I knew it was a big deal. I didn't know quite why it was a big deal at the time, but I remember, it was one of the times where we all sat down as a family and watched the show. There were a number of things, but this felt more significant than that. We did it with Star Wars. We did it with a couple other things. But I really remember it being a big deal and me being able to stay up past my bedtime to watch it. And so you drew the connection between the spankings, the punishment, the whoopings that you were receiving and what you witnessed in that show.
Yes, it planted the seed in my mind. Yes. Mm-hmm. And because of my dad's skittishness about Alabama, I felt I had a hunch that it had something to do with Alabama.
What did that type of punishment do to you, your family, your parents? Because there's a lot of people that are listening that either don't understand why parents do it, or they could be parenting and think that it's necessary. What type of dynamic did that create within your home?
Well, I think at the time, thank God, in a very painful way, I think that I was spared in the sense, I did not implode, right? Because everything around me was telling me and teaching me, you're a Black kid. And when Black kids have to be dealt with violently. That we don't have the luxury of making mistakes. And so because you're a Black person, you're a Black boy, your life is going to be hard. And we have to do this to you as love. Like this is and for some reason, I bought it. And I think part of it was because many of the kids around me were also getting the belt. And it was, it was something that was in the pop culture. I always say that when comedians run out of jokes and the audience isn't laughing, they can always pull out that beating black kids joke, and get the whole audience going, including black people. And that black children, in many ways, in terms of the pop culture, are the laughing stock of America. And so, because it was, I remember the show Good Times. I used to watch that. That was one of my favorite shows. And there was actually an episode where, and you can find it on YouTube if you want to watch it. There was an episode where this scene where there was a young boy who did not have a father, and he was actually probably worse off than the Evans family was. And Michael brought him home, the youngest son. And when it came time to eat, this kid was eating like he had never, like the food was going to disappear. And then at the end of the meal, he didn't want to study. The father James told them, you have to go study. And the kid didn't. So James took off his belt and took him in the room, and just brutally, even for television, it was a very, very violent scene. And when he came out, the kid asked him, why did you do that? And he said, because I love you, son, because I love you. And so that message at the time did not affect me. As a matter of fact, I believed in corporal punishment. I believed that black kids needed it, all the way up until I was probably in my late 20s, early 30s, when I started having nightmares. And so that's when I start to look at intergenerational trauma, because the nightmares that I was having, if you listen to my podcast, What Happened in Alabama, that podcast goes back to some of the corporal punishment I received as a kid. Because yes, though, while intellectually I believed in corporal punishment all those years, my spirit and my connectivity to God would not allow me to accept that. And there was something, I don't know what it was. Maybe it was, the work that, I was being prepared to do, pushed me into the situation where my body revolted and said, absolutely not. You need to check into that. You need to find out for once and for all what happened in Alabama. And so, yeah.
Before you did that, though, your curiosity or your need to address your nightmares drove you to a conversation you had with your parents. And, as I was listening, I was thinking, how did he bring his family into this where they were okay or comfortable with sharing these stories? Because I do think it's important, and we do the best that we can as parents. So this is not a judgment by any means, but it is a curiosity around the healing process of a family, which I think is ultimately what it is, and understanding where those lessons come from. But talk to me about your parents and your sisters and how they came along with your healing journey and your curiosity on the historical context.
Yeah, God bless my family. I think they know that I've always been a leader, willingly and unwillingly.
Yeah.
But because of that, I sometimes have this way of thinking, once again, that is really questioning. And my father was my best friend. So I was not one of the black boys that you see in the pop culture who struggled. I didn't struggle. I did have my father. I had my grandfather. I had my great grandfather. I actually knew him. He died when I was 26 years old. And so I was raised more by my father. My mother obviously had a very, very important role in my life. But I don't know why, but the decision was made when I was in third grade that my father would be more responsible for raising me. and that even though my parents were married, and that my mother would be more responsible for raising my sister. So at that time, I think the concern about my mother in a very conscious way, made the decision that raising a Black boy is a Black man's job. And so from that point forward, you know, most of my time was spent with my father. And, you know, we did a lot of fishing. We did a lot of playing sports. We did a lot of making music together. You know, we performed at a lot of churches all over the Twin Cities. And so that relationship that I had with my father was a very complex relationship. And if you really peel back the layers, which I have done and I continue to do in my work that I have coming forward in the Black father-son dynamic, you know, male relationships are complicated, you know, but when you infuse the race being Black in America part in it, they really are. And I was fortunate because I had a father who was a very, how do I describe it? My father was a larger than life man, but he was also a very cerebral man. As a matter of fact, he ended up, I can't remember a time when I was a kid that he wasn't in school. He was always taking night classes, and he did that all the way until he got his master's degree in psychology. And so my father and I used to have in-depth conversations about all kinds of issues. And so when I confronted my father about this, he was initially reluctant because I think he was shocked that you know, by how upset I was by the things that had happened, and also, but then he understood that I had started to do research and understood that I was more upset, not necessarily about the corporal punishment, but by my astonishment and understanding that Black people have perpetuated this cycle and called it our own for all of these generations, and literally pushing white supremacy in the home. And I think that was the part that really hurt me the most, because I never felt inferior to white people. Mm-hmm. And so I could not take that, and I could not accept it. And so how I got my dad involved was, you know, by confronting him. And then my father had taken a class with a man named Dr. John Taborn, who was a psychiatrist who taught at the University of Minnesota. My father had taken a class from him where Dr. Taborn had also mentioned the connection between the whipping and the belt. And so over time, my father came along with me. My younger sister was way ahead of me. She was questioning it when we were young. She's a cycle breaker as well. And so, and I think my older sister is a very more of a private person. So I really honor that. And also my mother is a person who still kind of believes in corporal punishment as, she as, you know, a necessity, or she has rationalized and understands that it is one of those things that, you know, Black people feel that they need to do. And so she was not as far along as my father was. But my father was the one who was from the South. And my father was the one who had the more in-depth understanding of the insidiousness of Jim Crow and slavery and how it still affects families today. And so the great thing about it is that I do come from a very strong, loving, close family. And so whether my mother and my older sister agreed with me or not, they still supported me, and they still came out and did an interview for the podcast. You know, some people will spend their life, you know, studying history, reading books, and you know, reading some of the darker, you know, literature in our Black, you know, some of the darker literature written by Black authors, you know, everything from The Color Purple to Celia, a Slave, to, you know, the harder stuff. Some people are not as open to reading about trauma. And so I think it just depends on, and you can have two people from the same family who might say, well, I'm not interested in history and I'm not interested in the way that history connects to the past. I would rather forget about it. And so for me, seeing that in the broader community as well, I understand that there are some Black people who will accept this conversation that I believe has to happen about trauma. And there are others who will say, you know what, I don't want to see any slave movies. I don't want to read any books about slavery. I don't want to know about slavery. All I want to know is about the positive aspects of our people. And I respect that. But I do say this, Mitch McConnell doesn't either. And neither does Governor DeSantis. As a matter of fact, they would applaud Black people who say, I don't want to hear about trauma. And because right now in the process, they're taking it out of school curriculums across the country. So I always say, be careful what you wish for. And if you actually agree with the GOP's agenda, which is okay, at least give them credit for their idea that Black trauma should be erased.
Yeah, or at least not talked about, right? They don't have the power for erasure. But your father was having nightmares, and he just said Alabama. And then as an adult, you began to have nightmares, and it was showing up in your world. And so you decided to go down this path, and you've mentioned the project and the work and the podcast. But talk to me about the journey that led to the podcast, and then share what the podcast is named.
Well, once again, this has been a lifelong process. I think it all traces back to roots. But then again, in 1991, when my sister graduated from Johnson C. Smith University, my father decided that he wanted to drive. And he wanted us to go to Alabama as part of that trip. He had an uncle named my Uncle Ike, who was mentioned prominently in the podcast, What Happened in Alabama, who my father wanted to interview because at the time he was about 93 years old. And as you know, probably, Alex Haley had that famous quote, when an elder dies, it's like a library burned down. And once again, even though my father wouldn't talk about Alabama as freely or the hard parts of it, my father was also a very curious man. And he was a brave man. He was afraid of a lot because of his experience in Jim Crow, Alabama, but he was also the kind of person that wanted to confront things. And so he went down because he really wanted to know more about his roots. His mother died when he was 12. His father was murdered when he was 26 years old. And so he really didn't know a lot because he left Alabama for Minnesota when he was 12. So we interviewed that uncle and we recorded it. And so that interview in 1991 laid the seed of understanding for me, because in that interview, he was talking about his father who was murdered. And I started to understand this reality that Jim Crow was not just about segregation. I was raised to believe that the worst that Black people went through during Jim Crow was having to be separated from white people and having to drink from separate water fountains. But my uncle planted the understanding in my mind that day that Black people were murdered, and that Jim Crow wasn't just segregation; it was a crime against humanity that was committed by our government against our people, because his father, that white man who killed him, Jack Taylor, was never brought to justice for that murder. And my uncle was in his 90s and he was still mourning the loss of his father. And he was still, talking to us about the fact that they wanted to get revenge, but the mother didn't want them to, because he said, I don't want to lose my son too. And so this was a very common narrative in the Black community. And so it planted that first seed that said, you know what, you need to look into this. And the most powerful thing of that, I didn't know it at the time, wasn't being told about the murder, but it was being told about my great-great-grandmother, Charity, who he said he hated. Mm-hmm. And he talked about how mean she was. He talked about the fact that when they got their own farm, she whipped them in the fields if they weren't working fast enough. But the picture of her was painted that she was just this crazy old woman inexplicably, but there wasn't any framing or understanding for how she got to be that way. And so this was a woman that was born in the 1800s. And so what ended up happening was I carried that interview. My father carried that interview for years in our spirit. And ever so often we would talk about it and how powerful it was that we got to meet our legendary Uncle Ike. So when Ancestry.com came out in 2014, I had a friend who turned me on to it, and that started it all. Mm-hmm. You know, I took a DNA test, and eventually my grandma Charity started popping back up saying, "Hey, how you doing?" With all of these years of investigative reporting experience, I felt guilty. I felt like I owed it to my ancestors. I owed it to my father, and I owed it to myself to dig into this story and to start.
Why did you feel guilty? Tell us why you felt guilty.
Well, because I had all this expertise and that I was solving all these other mysteries, but I didn't know the first thing about my own family. And so when I dug in and I found out that since 1837, I've had a family member murdered every generation, I felt compelled to write about it. And so I ended up getting a book deal for I Am Nobody's Slave, How Uncovering My Family's History Set Me Free, which comes out on HarperCollins in January. And then, you know, I got the deal to do What Happened in Alabama, which is a prelude to the book and everything, because I needed to tell this story, not just for my own family, but for the benefit of the millions of Black Americans alive today who went through what I now know and define as Jim Crow apartheid. Even though it's never been acknowledged. And I had to tell that story. And I also needed the rest of America to know the truth of these freedom fighters, the Jim Crow survivors and the people who lived through Jim Crow, who got the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed so that all the other people of color in this country and the LGBTQ community and all of the other people who have benefited from their activism could have basic rights as Americans. I wanted people to know what they lived through and the effects that we're still dealing with today.
Can you share for people that may or may not know what Jim Crow or Jim Crow laws are? We've talked about the outcome, the trauma, the lives that were lost as a result of it, but how would you describe Jim Crow?
Jim Crow was a set of laws that were established shortly after slavery, after emancipation, that basically put Black people back into a form of a caste system that restricted every element of our lives, our political rights, our economic rights. And it was known as segregation. It was sold as separate but equal. But really what it was a system in which thousands of people were lynched. Many Black women, as in slavery as well, were sexually assaulted. Many people turned up missing. And so the foundation of this system was violence. And the violence that came most often with no consequence. And so a system that literally hijacked the fight or flight systems of millions of Black people from the late 1800s all the way through 1964. And so when people walked outside their door, they were under these laws in which, you couldn't attend the University of Alabama. You couldn't, you didn't have equal rights at the bank. You didn't have equal rights in the voting system. You didn't have life, liberty, and happiness. And so that's what Jim Crow was. But the big part about it was the fear. And even if a person didn't have someone in their family who was murdered, they were living vicariously next to it. And so the awareness of Emmett Till and the thousands of other young Black boys and women who were akin to Emmett Till was enough to keep people, on edge. That said, it's also an era of self-determination. It's an era of Black collaboration, which once again, we used to fight and to continue to survive and thrive, not always because of America, but very often despite America. And that's the power of our people that makes us so almost seemingly irrepressible and almost thought to be people who can endure extraordinary amounts of pain, to be thought of to be both superhuman and subhuman, because we were able to withstand all of that, but still turn out to be, the freedom fighters once again that led America and pushed America to be American.
Yeah. I went earlier this year to the Whitney Plantation in Louisiana. And one of the things that talked about was the sexual abuse of women.
Yes.
But we don't talk about the sexual abuse that happened to men very often in terms of life as an enslaved or life after enslavement that was acts of violence perpetrated on them. And so we have physical and sexual and emotional violence that has occurred over many generations. And I think the important piece, and even as you're talking, I'm reflecting, my grandmother, born in 1915, Gertrude Green, was born in Alabama, in Menifee. And she would be the one, if something came on television and it mentioned slavery or anything that had to do with that time, she didn't want to talk about it. She didn't want to see it. She didn't want to be around it. Right. And as a kid observing it, you could interpret it all kinds of ways. But at the end of the day, she could not deal with the racial violence that has occurred in her life and stripped so many things away. And certainly didn't want that for us. And so I think that the behaviors come out of wanting more, and it manifests in many ways. And so I do think that this important story of your family allows us to pull our own family ties and strings. The way, so you've got the book deal, you did the podcast, and what has surprised you the most?
Well, look, I think what surprises me the most is the level of outpouring of support that I've gotten from people who relate to the material. I am very steadfast about making sure that I explain that what I'm reporting on is not every Black family's experience. I think that there are many African Americans who internalize slavery and Jim Crow as shame, and are very ashamed of the fact that our people went through it, and ashamed of our ancestors in many ways. And this research really, that was one of the things that surprised me, was just how the lack of shame that the people who were the beneficiaries of Jim Crow and slavery have. That if anyone should be ashamed, it should be them. And maybe secretly people carry shame, but I know my white cousins. As part of this research, I reached out to the descendants of the family who enslaved my great great grandmother Charity, which is why, once again, they said she was crazy. But when I found her will, I had a very, very strong understanding of why she was that way, because she was in captivity all the way into her adult life. And then she went through 70, 80 years of the Jim Crow apartheid system. And that was the part that people didn't know about or didn't want to talk about. And I think that was a very important, message. And so I think the thing that surprised me the most is the number of Black people who are ready for this conversation and who are receiving it in such a powerful way, and to share their own stories with their families, and understanding the power of genealogy is the way that I'm doing it in a different way. My method of researching family history goes far beyond just looking at birth dates and death dates, but there's a lot of oral history involved. There's a lot of newspaper clips involved. There's a lot of studying of history in very specific regions of the country and the world, going all the way back to Wales. And I think that people are starting to be open to this work. I have other friends who do work more around just the corporal punishment issue, but not as going in depth, and also not going into their own family's experience like I do, who are literally harassed and bullied by many people in our community. I haven't experienced that, and I'm actually ready for it. I want people to challenge me, and I can't wait until somebody steps to me and says, hey, I think beating Black children is a good thing. I think it helped me. And I think more Black children need it. And I don't think it has anything to do with slavery. I can't wait until I get into a public forum with someone like that, and I'm able to actually talk to them now that I'm informed. And so I think the last thing I'll say to you on this question, this very insightful question, is it also, one thing that shocked me is how little people know about history, but how much they believe they know, and how emboldened they believe they should be to actually speak on the issue of reparations, and to speak on all of these different issues without not even being able to know, basic facts about what Black people went through, and the system of America. And I think that people are just really in denial of this reality that for all but 60 years of America's existence, white supremacy has been the law. Now, this isn't me talking about the KKK or white militia groups or fringe groups. I'm not talking about that. I'm actually talking about the system that the government imposed for all the way from 1619 to 1964. Yeah. That was the law. So we have to understand that racial equality is a new concept in America. It's only been 60 years that Black people have been considered on paper to be equal to white people, people of color in general. And so we have to understand that if people of color were deemed by the law to be inferior to white people for all but 60 years of our existence, this explains why we've had such trouble. Why some people have so much trouble understanding history, but think they know so much about it, because we've been lied to. We've been lied to.
And even when you frame that at first, I'm like, what 60 years are you talking about? But I think you're talking about in legal, in law.
1964.
Yeah, you're not talking about in practice.
Right. I'm talking about in law. Right. It's been 60 years that America has tried to look like it's a nation of liberty and justice for all people of all races.
Yeah. One of the things you said earlier about, I think your older sister, was that she was a cycle breaker.
My younger sister.
Your younger sister. And what's striking me on this is the fact that you mentioned that you had a relative in each generation that was murdered, that you are talking about a grasp of one's own family history and the history of this country, and that it's very difficult to break cycles when you don't understand what the cycle is that needs to be broken, or you don't understand the implications of the context, the reasons why, so that you have a deeper understanding of where things ought to change or be broken. What do you think is the importance of breaking cycles in our families, black, white, or in the broader community?
Well, I think that, and thank you for that question. I think that it's a universal reality that families tend to hand down traditions, even in love. Toxic traditions can be handed down. I think that we as a nation are all victims of the scourge of white supremacy. And so as a result of that, that toxicity, that idea that had been handed down for generations to generations is a cycle that's hard to break. And I think that there are all kinds of situational things that we see in our lives, that pop up in our lives, that have everything to do with what our grandparents went through, what our great-great-grandparents went through. And what this has taught me is that learning about my great-great-grandmother Charity helped me understand myself. The vast majority of people can't tell you who their great-grandparents were or much about them. And if you can't do that, it's harder then to understand yourself, because they probably had influence on more than 40% of the socialization that you experienced as a child. And so I think that universally people of all races have to understand, and all backgrounds have to understand that, and that we do have the power to break cycles. Sometimes people do have the information.
They do.
And they choose not to.
Yeah. So I'm going to share. So I was back in, where was I? It was in Albuquerque. And this was quite a few years ago, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And I was traveling for a board meeting. And I walked into this board meeting, and it was in a Native American setting. And they were smudging, and they were talking about family. And we were to go around the table and talk about how our family arrived in America, and talk about our family history. And there were a couple of Black folks around the table. And the first one said, "Well, we know how we got here. I can't tell you much more." And by the time it got to me, I was crying. And I'm not a crier. I'm just not a crier. But I just could not stop crying. And they're like, what's going on with you? And I couldn't really articulate what was happening. And when I tell you, Lee, I cried through that whole board meeting. I'm like, just let it out, whatever it is I'm feeling. I can't articulate it yet, but I know that what it was that my mom did not know a lot about the history of her family. And it was something that she often wanted and missed. And because of the stripping of the documentation of who we are as a people, and the complicated background that she had and her family had, she didn't have all of that. And so there was this deep sadness of the inability for us to easily find the stories of where we hail from. We might know that as a people we went through slavery, but I can't generationally go back very far. And so where I'm going with this is that in some ways it's a privilege to understand where you've come from, and who your people are, and put names besides the dates, if you can find the dates and the names, and if those dates and names line up to what was actually who they were and how they describe themselves. And there's a level of privilege that groups of us have not been afforded.
I think, is that You want me to
I
respond
just
to
wonder
that?
if you feel that
Okay.
way, because when because you put out a challenge for us to understand our history, and I take that and I hear that, and I'm also saying, like, you almost have to have a full investigative unit just to find out some places what your grandparents' name were, your great grandparents. Some people are still trying to figure out who the dad. It is like, it can be a hard thing to understand your family history, and it can also be really necessary for the type of healing and connection and context that you are talking about.
Yes, you're right. It is a very arduous process. And I think that that's why I'm doing this work in many ways, because my book and my podcast, but especially my book and the book that I have coming after that, all demystify the process of how you do this work. I have a whole method that is used to help people because I believed that as well. I believed that a lot of the history was forever gone because my family was enslaved. But the truth of the matter is that both fortunately and unfortunately, our ancestors were property. They were commodities, which means that there were bills of sale, which I've seen. There were slave schedules. People paid taxes on them. People took insurance out on their lives to be able to put them into dangerous situations and feel that they could still get their money back if the person's killed in the process of climbing a tree or whatever it was. And so as a result, what I found, one of the things that really surprised me was that I was wrong, that these documents are not all gone, and that it really takes time. You mentioned that we cannot easily find this, and that is true, but we can find it. And I think that it's important for people to make it a lifelong commitment. It's not something that you have to do in a week's time. It will be things, if you get on ancestry.com, and I'm even talking about people who are adopted. I'm talking about people who, may not have known their father or may not have known their mother and didn't have them in their life. When you make that decision that you want to confront the hardest parts about your genealogy, there can be very powerful healing that goes with that if you are that kind of curious person who wants to break cycles and embrace the power of the positive aspects of your ancestors too. And so I want to make sure that being a person who has done this work and worked on it for over a decade, I want to make sure that I correct myself and let people know and give people the hope that there actually is information out there. If you look in the census records, if you look in all these records that I'm talking about, and old newspaper archives, and talk to elders, talk to them, and whenever you have a family event, go and talk to the oldest person in the room. And you will be surprised if they talk. A lot of the oral history that they give, it checks out. A lot of it is real. And when I pulled the newspaper articles about the things that they told me about years before I found the articles, many times they're spot on to what the ancestors and the elders said happened. I've had over 15 relatives pass away since I started this. And I just feel, yes, you're right. It is a privilege and it is a blessing to do this work because I got to interview all of them.
Yeah. And, most families have a person like you in it. Right. I may not be the historian. I have a cousin in Detroit, Reva, who we found on Ancestry, who lived in the street from my cousin Lynette, who has been diving into her history. And I'm looking at this photo right here that goes back into the 1800s that she sent, and she was able to find and has photos, and it's this beautiful mystery of who they were and what they gave that extends on to me and to my children. But most of us have someone in our family that are the people collecting the information. And so I do, there's an invitation here because I have, really appreciated this conversation. And, we often have many, many gifts. And you started out saying that you were a curious child, and that's not always appreciated. I was a curious child. And even in some of the workspaces I've been in, they're like, if you ask why one more time, I want the questions. I'm curious.
Yeah.
I love the human story. I love to understand the motivating factors. I like to have context, and the same thing that has been my gift has often sometimes created the complexity, right? We're talking about complexity in
Yes.
story.
Yes.
And so I think there's a leaning in, and to the folks that aren't in the Black community that are listening, I think this exercise is just as important. And you mentioned the white side of your family. And I think to break cycles and understand how we break white supremacist behavior, you have to understand the legacy of what that meant for you and your family, to understand where you might see it in yourself. And ultimately, that's what we need to get to, is a place where people can live their full selves and be humanized in their experiences.
Yeah, this podcast, I really encourage people to listen to this podcast of all races, because it will give you an understanding. And, one last thing I wanted to say to you in particular, you mentioned your grandmother who was born in 1915, and I had read about you before we did this interview. You're just very impressive. And you stand on the shoulders of giants. Your mother, I know you and your mother were close. You talked about that, and that informed your philanthropic commitment that you have now. And you're also, a descendant of Dr. Richard Green, who was a incredible educator who I remember. I didn't have the privilege to meet him, but I did read about him as a young boy growing up in Minnesota. And, so you have to remember that the questions that you're asking, the boards you're sitting on, all of this work that you're doing now is direct result of those people. And to have to be able to accomplish what Dr. Green accomplished for a Black man coming from the time that he came out of, once again shows what I need to emphasize, was that my book and my project is not just about trauma. It's actually about resilience and the ability of Black people to thrive despite the trauma. Oftentimes we carry it. When you see a Black executive in a meeting, most of the time, to get that seat at that table, that person has slayed dragons, especially a Black woman. And so when you see a Black woman in a leadership position, you know that there's a lot that she's carrying. When you see a Black man in a leadership position, you know there's been many times where he's had to suppress his feelings of anger, even though he's the leader he's the CEO or the executive producer of the whole place. He can't show his true emotions because it could be weaponized against him in ways that, white people can show up and not have that same pressure. They can show up as their authentic selves, demanding the best from everybody. And so what this tells me is that you've made it, and you will continue to go forward because of the legacy of your family. If right now, if you decided that you wanted to go even deeper on Dr. Green, that information is in there. You see what I'm saying? And when people accomplish these great feats in life, there is a paper trail. And then you can use that paper trail to go deeper and deeper and deeper. So I just wanted to say that to encourage you, because you've encouraged me. And I want to thank you for having me on your show. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for saying their names. And as we close, if people wanted to find your podcast, or if they wanted to find your forthcoming book, where would they go?
Yes, the book is available right now for pre-order on Amazon.com. It's called I Am Nobody's Slave: How Uncovering My Family's History Set Me Free. And the podcast, What Happened in Alabama, is whathappenedinalabama.org. Whathappenedinalabama.org you can go to, or you can actually go to Apple, Spotify, or anywhere where podcasts are available.
Thank you, Lee Hawkins. Thank you for joining Conversations with Chanda, a podcast that lifts up the stories and the leadership of those in our community. Thank you.
God bless you so much. Thank you.
God bless you.